Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, 18th of September, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Charles Malet. Welcome to the programme, Charles.
Thank you, Mike.
And Vanessa Beeley from Damascus. Vanessa, we're going to get straight on into this issue in Lebanon of exploding pagers and just put a name to what that is, what that event is.
Well, I mean, effectively, it's state terrorism from Israel that ended in the massacre, or 11 people killed, and officially 2,800 injured and maimed. And the figures are rising. I'm hearing numbers of around 4,200. So let's just have a look at a video of what actually happened. So basically an order of, I think it was in the region of 5,000 pages were ordered 5 months ago and distributed to members of Hezbollah, which could also be, of course, the political side of Hezbollah. We'll come into more detail on all of this shortly. 2 children have actually died. Yesterday, there was only a 10-year-old Lebanese girl who was killed directly in the explosion. Today, a young boy, I think the same age, succumbed to his injuries and also died. As I said, there have so far been 11 fatalities. So this is in Al Monitor exclusive. Hezbollah suspicions forced Israel to expedite Lebanon pager attack. It was not the Israelis' preferred course of action, according to the sources who contributed to the article, to detonate the pagers ahead of a full-scale war with Hezbollah. But security officials made an 11th-hour decision after at least 2 Hezbollah members suspected something was amiss with the device. Now, I've also heard, I think also from Al Monitor, that one of those Hezbollah members that had suspicions was assassinated to prevent him saying anything. The second one, as far as I know, is still alive, but that was a more recent detection. So this is basically the timeline. Hezbollah suspicions forced Israel to expedite Lebanon pager attack. Pentagon denies its role. We'll come into that in a second. Air France and I think Lufthansa have cancelled Tel Aviv flights and flights to Beirut in fear of escalation. Again, the US denies its involvement in the Lebanon explosions, but of course that's a familiar pattern. The Iranian ambassador was injured. I believe it's not seriously. There were stories today that he had been blinded by the explosion. That's being denied now by the Lebanese health authority. So Israel carried out the pager attack against Hezbollah. But of course, when you're talking about pagers, that many thousand pagers in amongst civilian population in markets, as you saw in the video, in crowded areas, it's going to impact also on civilians. As I said, following intelligence information, that 2 members of the Hezbollah group caught wind that the pages had been breached. High-level regional intelligence sources told Al Monitor that the decision to carry out the operation was forced on Israel following the intelligence lap. The sources revealed that thousands of pages Hezbollah acquired for its members were booby-trapped by Israel before they were delivered recently to the organization. And one has to assume, we were discussing this, Mike, that the explosives would have been planted in that interim time between manufacture and delivery to Hezbollah. This is in Reuters. Israel planted explosives in 5,000 Hezbollah pages, and let's see what they add to the Al Monitor report. This was a later report today. So it explains that Hezbollah fighters have been using pages as a low-tech means of communication in an attempt to evade Israeli location tracking. Two sources familiar with the group's operations told Reuters this year. But senior Lebanese sources said the devices had been modified by Israel's spy service at the production level. So this slightly contradicts the idea that something would have been implanted in that interim period. Mossad injected a board inside of the device that has explosive material that receives a code. It's very hard to detect it through any means, even with any device or scanner, allegedly. The source said 3,000 of the pages exploded when a coded message was sent to them simultaneously, activating the explosives. Up to 3 grams of explosives were allegedly hidden in the pages. I'm hearing actually that it was 20 grams. So we're getting sort of varying reports at the moment, just trying to make sense of them all. Again, this was back to Al Monitor. Pentagon denies the role in suspected Israeli pager attacks in Lebanon. Top official Lloyd Austin called his Israeli counterpart Yoav Gallant for the second time in roughly 36 hours on Tuesday in the aftermath of a suspected Israeli attack believed to have targeted Hezbollah operatives by detonating mobile pager devices. So basically, the Pentagon and Pentagon spokespeople are saying they had nothing to do with it. However, in Israeli media, if we just move on, I think, yes, this was in Walla. Sorry for the slight mess of the screenshot. That's how it comes out on the Hebrew website. But here they're actually saying that Defense Minister Gallant called his US counterpart Lloyd, saying that Israel was going to take action in Lebanon soon, but refused to give any details. So probably the truth is somewhere in the middle of that. What is the response from the US State Department, particularly spokesperson Matthew Miller, who told reporters in Washington that US urges Iran not to escalate regional tensions following the pager attack? So as usual, no condemnation from the US State Department of what is effectively state terrorism by their ally Israel. Now, interestingly, again, as I've mentioned before, every time the US envoy or Secretary Blinken arrives in Israel for talks, we see an escalation, normally in Gaza or in the West Bank, but this time Amos Hochstein, the US envoy, arrived in Israel for talks to defuse potential war with Hezbollah. And of course, we've seen an increase in the belligerent Israeli rhetoric regarding a war in the north in the last few days, particularly with Netanyahu threatening to sack Yoav Gallant, defense minister. So Hezbollah has put out a statement vowing to retaliate. Said Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, is speaking tomorrow on Thursday. So then we assume more details following an investigation will be given. And of course, what did I say? Blinken heads to the Middle East. So we can expect potentially further escalation. So these are the actual pages. This was reported in TRT World, AP 900. This is what we know about one of the pages that exploded in Lebanon. And there you can see one of the destroyed pages. They managed to determine that it's the Apollo pager. And if we look at who is the manufacturer of this, just a brief description about the Apollo 900. People can freeze frame and read it to get more details later. But basically, it's a one-way messaging service. I'm not very technical on these kind of things. But of course, that is why Hezbollah were trying to avoid location detection by using these fairly simple pager devices. Taiwan's Gold Apollo says it did not make the pages used in the Lebanon blast, and who does it basically finger for that. The product was not ours. It was only that it had our brand on it. Gold Apollo founder and president Su Ching Kwan told reporters at the company's offices. Gold Apollo authorized a company called BAC to use our brand trademark for product sales in specific regions, but the design and manufacturing of the products are entirely handled by BAC, the statement said. So let's have a look at who BAC are. BAC are basically a Budapest-based organization. Now, having checked, Gold Apollo have a number of subsidiaries throughout Europe, but it's strangely coincidental to me that they fingered a Hungary firm, following, of course, the disputes with Orban over his peace-broking missions, etc. Blood is needed in Lebanon. There have been calls to Iran and Iraq are already there. Syria is itself trying to organize blood banks here to collect blood, to send it to Lebanon, but there are also injured being received here in Damascus, I've heard in the last few hours. Lebanon itself, so that is the government in Lebanon, Lebanon state, rather than, of course, Hezbollah being a semi-non-state actor, although Hezbollah are involved in the Lebanese government, to file a complaint at the UN Security Council over the Israeli pager explosion attack. And then also, if we look at the potential context for this attack, I've already mentioned that there are claims that Israel brought the attack forward. They were planning to use it as a forward attack before escalating against Lebanon, and they brought it forward because of the detection. That's one theory. Of course, the other theory is that in the last few days, it has been admitted by Israel that the Hezbollah strike, which, if you remember, was in retaliation for the assassination of Fouad Shukra in July, from memory, in southern Beirut, actually led to the fatalities of 22 Unit 8200 members and 74 reported members injured. So let's just have a very quick look at what Al Mayadeen says about that. So it's European security sources have reported to Al Mayadeen that the recent strikes by the Islamic resistance in Lebanon, targeting the headquarters of Unit 8200 in the Lilot base and the airbase of Ain Shama, have been substantially successful. According to sources, the attack, dubbed Operation Arbaeen, has resulted in significant casualties within the intelligence unit, with fatalities reaching 22 and 74 members reported injured. So that was, in reality, a major attack. But, now we're left with the scenario where we have multiple amputations, according to reports I'm receiving from medical sources in Lebanon. As I mentioned, I think 500 eye operations, the majority of whom, of course, have had their eyes removed because the injury is irreversible, hands being blown off, internal injuries to hips, which are major injuries. If you imagine the pages being in someone's pocket, it doesn't take a great imagination to comprehend the diabolical nature of this attack. It's pure sadism. This isn't warfare. This is state terrorism. And it includes, of course, the maiming and injuring and deaths of civilians that would have been in those crowded areas when the pages were detonated. It's horrific. And of course, it takes us back to the water explosion in 2020, when I think 6,000 were killed. If the higher numbers are correct, 4,200 and heading up towards 5,000, we're getting close to that kind of tragedy for Lebanon.
Yeah, and Vanessa, reading this morning's quotes from eye surgeons talking about, many people having had both eyes removed as a result of this. So this is devastating for them. And, that the final section of the video clip that you showed at the beginning of that, that the lady who was on the till who had nothing, didn't have a pager, had nothing to do with anything other than she was working in a supermarket, clearly had eye damage as a result of that. It is horrendous. And then the other question that needs to be asked is, where were these explosives added to the product? Was it in the manufacturing process itself, or, as you suggest, in somewhere between manufacture and delivery? Either way, those explosives must have been in a foreign country, in this case Hungary, and therefore at least anybody that was potentially involved in the manufacture, but then also anybody potentially involved in the delivery of the devices as well, at risk. So it's not just an attack on Lebanon, it's actually an attack on other countries, including countries in Europe as well. We have all this rhetoric about Russia and its bringing warfare onto European soil, but no comment about this from David Lammy or anybody else in the West.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that. Now let's move on to David Lammy then, and he was tweeting this out yesterday. The climate and nature crisis is the most profound and universal source of global disorder. We're resetting Britain's approach to this agenda. Climate and nature will be central to all the Foreign Office does. Now, why would that be? Is that about climate change and mitigation of climate change, or is it about geopolitics? Let's just have a listen to a minute and a half or so of what Lammy said yesterday.
But we need a hard-headed, realist approach towards using all levers at our disposal, from the diplomatic to the financial. And I say to you now, these are not contradictions, because nothing could be more central to the UK's national interests than delivering global progress on arresting rising temperatures. My argument to you today is that demands for action from the world's most vulnerable and the requirements for delivering security for British citizens are fundamentally aligned. And this is because the crisis is not some discrete policy area divorced from geopolitics and insecurity. The threat may not feel as urgent as a terrorist or an imperialist autocrat, but it is more fundamental. It is systemic, it's pervasive, and accelerating towards us at pace. Look around the world. Countries are scrambling to secure critical minerals, just as great powers once raced to control oil. We cannot let this become a source of conflict. In the Arctic and Antarctic, global warming is driving geopolitical competition over the resources lying beneath the ice. And in places like the Sahel, South Sudan, Syria, rising temperatures are making water and productive land even scarcer. These are not random events delivered from the heavens.
Sorry, I got caught there. It must be catching. Maybe it's a disease. These are not random events. These are absolutely not random events. That's probably the only thing I agree with him on in that particular segment. But what we very clearly get from that is that the agenda isn't about temperature or climate or any perceived climate emergency. It's about raw materials. It's about assets under the ground or under the ice or wherever it happens to be. And of course, the Arctic is mentioned and so on. We'll come on to that in a second. So this is a graphic that we're pushing out on Twitter this morning. We will build a global clean power alliance. Well, I'm not clear how they're going to do that, since half the world seems to have gone the other way with BRICS and so on, but they're going to build this global clean power alliance, unlock more climate finance. That's another key part of this, and reverse the decline in global biodiversity. Nonsense. They're not doing anything to do any of that. In fact, with the warfare that they're pursuing, they're only increasing the decline in global biodiversity. But just this whole idea of the Sahel, of the Arctic, and so on. Let's just remind ourselves of some of the comments that we've seen in recent weeks. This is from Jens Stoltenberg talking about NATO and not wanting to view moving NATO into the South China Sea, but taking into account that China is coming closer to us in the Arctic, in Africa. This narrative about the Arctic, the Antarctic and the Sahel is something that we see time and time and time again from multiple voices. It is something that is clearly a common narrative that's been decided upon. The European Union, very in particular, interested in the Sahel region in particular. And so is the UK with their regional development partnership that goes back a number of years. And we can't forget Tony Blair's absolute interest in this area, the Tony Blair Institute, very active in the Sahel region. The question is why. We'll see in a second. This is something that the Africans are particularly keen to sort of push back against. But we've got to remember why this is. This is because the Russians, the Chinese are active in that area. They are developing those countries. They're providing infrastructure and so on. This is something that the West perceives as getting out of its control very, very quickly, and something that they feel that they need to deal with very, very quickly. But Lamy's speech, nothing to do with temperature of the atmosphere, and everything to do with raw materials and what we can dig out of the ground, and making sure that we maintain control of what can be dug out of the ground. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think he sort of joins the queue of ministers to whom we should invert everything they say when we listen to them. I mean, he's really talking about the exact opposite that his words suggest, and particularly on the mineral side of it, and not just the destruction of the landscape that we're supposed to be protecting under all this sort of rhetoric, but also the enormous cost to life and welfare of the people that are forced to mine cobalt and lithium and all the rest of it. But of course, that's never referred to.
No, indeed. Okay, well, let's move on then. And child abuse.
Child abuse in the news again, although one might say there's never a right reason, but in this instance, Hugh Edwards, who, having been found guilty of a number of offences pertaining to indecent images of children, received a 6-month suspended sentence, which means he will not go to prison. And the CPS say that WhatsApp chat between the male, this is a person he was communicating with, and Edwards was sexual in nature, and it also showed that Edwards was giving him gifts and money. Within the chat, there were numerous sexually explicit images, including 41 indecent images of children. Now, this gives us cause to think about the wider criminal justice system, but also about the overall attitude towards abuse of children. And we can start with his former employer, the BBC, who in a statement back in August said, Mr. Edwards pleaded guilty to an appalling crime. Had he been upfront when asked by the BBC about his arrest, we would never have continued to pay him public money. He has clearly undermined trust in the BBC and brought us into disrepute. Well, that might well be the case, but that's quite the conditional, in that the BBC are effectively washing their hands of responsibility by saying that they effectively had no further duty to investigate and should just take at face value anything that he told them. And of course, by extension, had he not said that and had this not come to light, then they would have been absolutely right in just sweeping it under the carpet and carrying on as normal. So that reflects very, very poorly on the BBC, but not necessarily in the way that they're suggesting. And we just go back now to UNICEF and to 1991, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think this is particularly pertinent since we head relentlessly towards the idea of one world government. But just to point to Article 19 and 34. Article 19, protection from violence, abuse and neglect. Governments must do all they can to ensure that children are protected from all forms of violence, abuse, neglect and bad treatment by their parents or anyone else who looks after them. Or Article 34, sexual exploitation. Governments must protect children from all forms of sexual abuse and exploitation. Well, quite. In the United Kingdom, we have enshrined in law the Protection of Children Act 1971. And this is what piece of legislation Edwards was effectively tried against. Either way, though, meaning that he in fact went to the magistrates' court and not Crown Court, the maximum being 10 years custody. But of course, we see that the incredible range of sentence being from a community order up to 9 years of custody. So just to look at the detail of it and how open to interpretation all of this is, he had 7 what are called category A images, which I will define in a second. And it starts by saying, in most cases, the intrinsic character of the most serious of the offending images will initially determine the appropriate category. If, however, the most serious images are unrepresentative of the offender's conduct, a lower category may be appropriate. So effectively giving the magistrate or the judge a lot of room for manoeuvre, presumably depending on the defendant himself or herself. So with apologies for the nature of this, but it is written down by the Sentencing Council, indecent images, category A, possession of images involving penetrative sexual activity, possession of images involving sexual activity with an animal or sadism. Now, Edwards had 7 of those and possibly many more, of course, because the device that was initially sought was not found. There was a delay. So it's entirely possible that a lot of evidence went missing. In terms of what this government, well, I was talking about track records concerning individuals, of course, the perennial reminder that Keir Starmer was indeed Director of Public Prosecutions when the Jimmy Savile case was effectively bungled. And of course, again, just like the BBC, being caught out and therefore talking about shortcomings is going back to 2013, but effectively absolutely not shouldering responsibility for what was not done. I should just point out that, first of all, UK Column does have a Substack page, so please, if you do use Substack, do make use of that. But you'll find a piece circled there in red about the 7 men committing offences. This is going back to Rotherham, but jailed for 106 years. And this, of course, points to the persistent failure by police to actually be able to deal with this under what was then Operation Stovewood, and these highlighted by the J report of 2014 going into the inquiry into child abuse in Rotherham. So there is absolute pedigree in this area of failure to deal with offences of this nature. Now, the reason this is so important is that the government, of course, does at its disposal have a judiciary with which it can dispense justice. And the reason I put it in those terms is that we have a big issue now about whether or not we have separation of powers. Of course, the interview with Claire Wills-Harrison, The Wonky Scales of Justice, out recently, we go into the failure of the separation of powers. And of course, over the last couple of months, we've seen a response to what's being called far-right violent disorder. And so we have the Home Office putting a tweet out being effectively tough, apparently, on crime, but only certain types. So let us be very clear: those violent and criminal attacks were not protests. They were not about grievance. They were thuggery, racism, and crime. The Prime Minister and I, being the Home Secretary, made it clear that criminals would pay the price for their violence, and we meant it. And that's from Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, back on September the 5th. So there are many examples one could pick out to highlight the utter hypocrisy and inconsistency of her position. And here we have BBC reporting, man jailed for shouting at police dog and using racist slurs. So apparently fine to promulgate images of abused children, especially if you're a highly paid BBC correspondent reporter. But anyway, nonetheless, with political capital, of course, highlighted here by NSPCC in a sense, in that whilst it is, of course, fair to point out that these images are put about the place by the use of communications platforms, it's how exactly this is addressed. So we've got from the NSPCC saying that we're calling on tech companies to take swift and ambitious action to address what is currently happening on their platforms. And we're urging Ofcom to significantly strengthen its approach to tackling child sexual abuse through effective enforcement of the Online Safety Act. And we go back to the government document on end-to-end encryption, which is the way in which these messages apparently are made secure, and child safety. So in effect, one might say quite right to deal with this, but it's a question of where it goes and what the parameters are. But they specify in this document that there were over 34,000 offences in the UK relating to online indecent images of children in 2022, and that this means that they are reckoning that there are over 800,000 people who could pose a sexual threat to children, and the prevalence of the most severe forms of online child sexual abuse have more than doubled since 2020. So if indeed they can be corroborated, of course, very alarming statistics. But it should not be ignored that with the Online Safety Act and the way that the government is treating this, it is as though it is a lever with which to surveil and monitor communications at large, as opposed to necessarily dealing with the specific issue of child abuse. And the government's track record, or government's track records on this, are terrible. And one might say that the modus operandi of the government is simply being extended by its complete failure to deal with this, especially when there is the opportunity to use the phrase that, of course, the Home Secretary has many times over the last few months, to set an example. But the example that's been set by not giving Hugh Edwards, a very public figure, a proper prison sentence is a terrible one. So I only need to remind you how children were treated in 2020 and 2021. Here we have a piece from the New Scientist where small children were forced to cover their faces for no apparently good reason whatsoever, with disastrous effects that were quite obviously known about at the time. And a reminder, of course, that the Committee on Vaccines recommended that children as young as 6 months old were given a drug that had not been trialled. So might be a deviation from sexual abuse of children, but nonetheless, the wider topic of child abuse is something this government is absolutely failing on.
Yes, okay, thank you, Charles, for that. Okay, now we do need your support, so if you would like to support us, let's see how you might do that. So up in the top left-hand corner of the UK Column website there, we have links to the various platforms that we're on. That we're on a couple of other platforms that we will add to this. But if you click on those little icons, we have already removed Facebook from there because, of course, we've been effectively thrown off Facebook now. You could click on the link here, which will take you to our support page, which will give you options for helping us out. But I just wanted to also point out that there are other things on the UK Column front page that you might want to have a look at, particularly the editor's choice section. And what we do each week is that we choose some articles that are from the past that are relevant to what's going on in current affairs. And just a reminder of what we've published in the past, still very relevant in many, many cases. Also, just note the comment section further on down the page. Don't be afraid to scroll down the page and have a look at the UK Column website. But if you do look at any particular article, please use the share icons that are provided. We'll add a Telegram one there in the not too distant future. And also, if you want to view the comments for each, you can do so by clicking there. So on the support page itself, there are options. You could make a donation or you could join the community. And of course, by joining the community, you get access to UK Column Extra and other members only benefits. You could pick something up at the UK Column shop, or you could we have an affiliate arrangement with Clive de Carl for any supplements that you may want as well. So those are the main ways you can help us out if you possibly can. Share the material you find on the UK Column website. That is the main place to go to find UK Column content, but do share it on the platforms if you possibly can. Now, tomorrow we have an interview going out with Dr. Robin Kelly, if we can put that on screen. So this is looking at, this is Debbie Evans looking at this, asking a number of questions of Dr. Robin Kelly, including what is the future of healthcare? So let's just have a quick listen to a short excerpt from this.
Evidence-based medicine has been based on papers, studies in journals, which we know from so many of the editors have most of them come out and saying that you can't trust it. You know, was it Maria Engels from the New England Journal of Medicine several years ago said, look, 90% of the papers are rubbish. Now, AI is just going to collect all that information that's come from academic departments who have been funded by big corporations and collate those and say, this is the way you're going to practice medicine. And the actual discriminating doctor is being cut out of this.
So join us for that 1 p.m. As in the usual places if you possibly can. Then yesterday's interview, which was with Dr. Sabine Hazan, is up on the UK Column website if you'd like to go and have a look at that. Don't forget the event in Bristol, UK Column on location, 19th of October 2024. Tickets are selling fast. There are a few tickets left. If you can possibly pick one up, please do so. Fantastic range of speakers are going to be at that. UK Column team will be at that as well. And we look forward to seeing as many people as possible there. And Brian and I, another reminder, will be speaking at the Heritage Party Conference on the 20th of September. Details at heritageparty.org. And Charles, you are speaking.
Yes, in Stroud for a Project Libertas event on Saturday, the 12th of October, alongside Gemma Cooper, Andrew Bridgen and Sandy Adams. So for tickets, go to eventbrite.co.uk and search Project Libertas and Stroud to pick up a ticket for that.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Now, let's move on then to assisted dying.
Yeah, indeed, which is getting increasing amounts of coverage and certainly being couched in terms that suggest that we all agree that it's absolutely got to happen and that it's a very good idea, highly questionable, of course. But the reason that this is being discussed right now and was referred to on the UK Column News by Debbie Evans on Friday is because the Nuffield Council on Bioethics has produced a document referring to a citizens' jury that was put together. Now, there are many details from that we'll come on to, but just to give an indication of how the narrative's been built and effectively the sort of conflation of assisted dying with all the other things that were going on. We look at the work of Matt Hancock, reported back in 2020 in the Daily Mail about the slightly ludicrous position of people apparently being able to leave the country to die in an assisted fashion during the coronavirus lockdown. Hancock, of course, then put to the fore for the full sort of indoctrination treatment in 2021 by the Telegraph there towards legalising it. Now, to give a flavour of what the Nuffield Council on Bioethics deals with, these are the 5 reports that it's produced in the year 2024. First of all, the assisted dying one, which we're just about to go into, the future of health and artificial intelligence, which again, Debbie has covered in great detail previously. Then we've got research using neural organoids, again, something UK Column has dealt with in detail, as it has stem cell-based embryo models and genomics, healthcare and research. Those are the sort of areas that they get into. Now, particularly on this idea of what's called a citizens' jury, we look to the Sortition Foundation, which again, Ben Rubin in particular has talked about, and I know there's going to be a lot more concentration on this by UK Column, but the foundation rather proudly declare that they use the fairest selection algorithm. And of course, what I should point out at this stage is by using terminology such as algorithm and effectively stating that all of this is done by computers, it's as though to suggest that it is legitimized by the fact it's done by machine and not man, and therefore must be impartial and objective. But I would say not so. However, the article from Nature, in which they try to reinforce the point that algorithms, or there is an algorithm that may be fair, they talk about a citizens' assembly being selected by sortition, which they describe as being a microcosm of society. Its participants are representative of the population, and thus its deliberation simulates the entire population convening under conditions where it can really consider competing arguments and get its questions answered from different points of view. However, whether this goal is realised in practice depends on exactly how assembly members are chosen. Exactly, a bit of a chink in the armour there. Now, they go on and say, as the final and most complex component of the selection process, the selection algorithm has great power in deciding who will be chosen to represent the population. Well, of course it does. And in this case, we are being led to believe that after the selection of 34 people in the United Kingdom, only 30 of whom could actually turn up, whether virtually or in person, and only 28 of whom, in fact, had a bearing on the outcome, it is perfectly ludicrous in the first instance to suggest that that smaller number of people could possibly represent the views of the entire nation. So what we're going to do now is just have a quick look at the Harvard Business Review, talking about what's called algorithmic bias, because, of course, algorithms are written by people. An algorithmic bias occurs when algorithms make decisions that systematically disadvantage certain groups of people, it can have disastrous consequences when applied to key areas such as healthcare, criminal justice, and credit scoring. Now, the point they're trying to make is the sort of the social justice context, effectively saying that it persecutes ethnic minorities and that sort of thing. But of course, the obverse is true in that it can be used perfectly easily to discriminate in what might be called a positive sense against any group. But the fact is that it is entirely fallible and it is led by humans. And of course, we see that the Sortition Foundation itself has significant bias by indicating how pleased they are that Labour has the intention to use citizens' assemblies to address assisted dying and the House of Lords reform. Now, for more on sortition, there are other places to go on the UK Column website, but one I should draw your attention to, because it is part of a whole series, is A Dissident's Guide to the Constitution, the episode 5 there, part 1, Democracy, a British Value, ? But that series is absolutely well worth listening to, and sortition is a big part of it, and UK Column will come on to explain exactly why that is. But with this in mind, and with the particularly the Nuffield, which of course is part of a much bigger effectively sort of Nuffield landscape, we look at the founder or the man that set up this, who became Viscount Nuffield, William Morris, the car magnate, from the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. And it's just worth pointing out, when we consider all the various social biases and the things that the Sortition Foundation in particular would take great care to avoid getting ensnared in, he was persuaded back in 1930, apparently, they say, by Oswald Mosley during the slump, to put up £50,000 to help found his new party, in the mistaken belief that Mosley favoured some of his ideas on involving businessmen in government to secure economic stability and rational action. Well, that's very much a watered-down version of what Nuffield has actually been perhaps accused of saying or thinking about certain things and the way that society should work. But of course, again, this is completely glossed over. The other point worth making is that Nuffield Health, which again is formed on the back of the enormous Nuffield wealth, receives a lot of money from government, had £250 million from government in the last 4 years, and would stand, if it moves into the area of assisted dying, to make an enormous sum of money. So that is very, very relevant to the push for assisted dying, run here by the Campaign for Dignity in Dying. And they give us an update. Again, this has been reported on much, but Lord Falconer's bill, the assisted dying bill, set for its second reading on the 15th of November. And just to give an indication of the public programming that's done, I've just taken a couple of screenshots off the campaign website, and here we see a picture of a lady with the caption, the true cost, how the UK outsources death to Dignitas, which of course is in Switzerland, and that's where people were apparently prohibited from getting to, or find prohibitively expensive. The cost of dying in Switzerland under such conditions is reckoned to be about £15,000. And of course, to say the idea again that we must all consider that this must happen, one British person travels there every 8 days. The reason I've chosen these two is that, and this is across the campaign website, the images used of people are quite clearly not extremely old, extremely frail, or extremely ill, at least visibly. I know it's very hard to tell, but the point that's being made, that has been repeatedly by Mike, going back to the Matthew Paris article, is that we are conditioned now to think that assisted dying forms part of the whole idea of taking social responsibility and doing the right thing and effectively removing yourself from society no matter what your age, which is a very, very disturbing track to go down.
It certainly is. Okay, let's move on to censorship then. And we're heading over to Australia first and see how they're doing in terms of bringing forward this narrative. So here is the Right Honourable Michelle Rowland, MP, Minister for Communications in Australia. It's time to act on misinformation and disinformation. So let's just have a quick look at some of the points that she makes here. Seriously harmful misinformation and disinformation spreads at speed and at scale across the digital world. Recent events in Australia and abroad, and she was talking about Southport here, demonstrate the real world impact that it's having on social cohesion and safety of communities. She said, while misinformation and disinformation may be shared by well-intentioned people who believe the information is credible, it's often spread with intent intent to do harm. Not quite sure how she knows that, but she talks about bad actors using bots and troll farms. And she's particularly worried about interference in democracy, economy and society. And so they have introduced the Communications Legislation Amendment (brackets Combating Misinformation and Disinformation) Bill 2024, which is going to hold big tech to account, while balancing the freedom of expression. So we're hearing the same kind of rhetoric. So looking at this bill itself, they define disinformation as any content that contains information that is reasonably verifiable as false, misleading or deceptive. And my first question would be, is how much information that comes out from government or mainstream press is reasonably verifiable as false? It's quite a significant proportion. But anyway, it goes on to say, when the provision of the content on the digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. And then the question is, well, what is serious harm? And they define that as vilification of a group in Australian society distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, or national or ethnic origin, or vilification of an individual because of a belief that the individual is a member of such a group. So this, just like in the UK then, the other point to make is that the dissemination of professional news content is explicitly excluded from the bill. So that's what's going on in Australia. It's mirroring very much what's going on in the United Kingdom. And we'll have more to say on this idea of professional news content in the not too distant future. But in the case of professional news content, let's have a look at this. This is the latest survey from Ofcom talking about where people are finding their news or getting their news. And there's some good news in this little graph, because what we're discovering is that the number of people going to BBC One for the news has fallen from 49% in the UK to 43% between last year and this year. The number of people that is going to ITV or to STV or to UTV has fallen from 34% last year to 30% this year. Facebook stays the same at 30%. iPlayer is roughly the same. YouTube, unfortunately, is going up as a source of news for people in the UK. Sky News is also gone up a little bit. It's come down from 21% to 19%. BBC News channel itself, the main BBC News channel, has fallen from 23% to 18%. And the BBC News website and app has fallen from 22% last year to 18% this year. Instagram is up 2%, and X is the same as last year. So it's, we can take these statistics. It is a survey, after all. We can take them as far as we like, but it seems to be offering a little bit of good news in the sense that the BBC in particular is finding itself being switched off. But in the meantime, then following on from the United States criticism of RT recently, and the claim that RT has been funding so-called influencers on the internet to push Russian disinformation, the US has now decided to alert the world to RT's global covert activities, and has decided to sanction FT. The Foreign Office then has made a statement on this, saying that the UK supports the US in their assessment that RT is not only a state-funded propaganda house, but deliberately working to undermine our collective security on behalf of the Kremlin. US information shows that RT is engaged in information operations and covert influence around the world. These activities strike at the democratic foundations of other countries, using intelligence operations and shadowy networks to incite political violence and spread dissent around the world. We're going to talk about this with Vanessa much more in Extra, but I just want to remind everybody, of course, that same Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, through its so-called Counter-Disinformation and Media Development Programme, funded the Integrity Initiative. If you want to know more about that, get on the UK Column website. And we also need to mention BBC Media Action and their actions around the world, also the Thomson Reuters Foundation, but we'll talk about a bit more about this in Extra. And sticking with media then, Vanessa, let's come to you. And there seems to be a bit of a problem has been happening at the Jewish Chronicle.
Well, yeah, basically since October the 7th, the Zionist Hasbara machine, propaganda machine, has been struggling, let's say, and has been routinely exposed for providing fabrications, fake news, misleading reports, etc. So the Jewish Chronicle put this out by one of its leading writers, Elon Perry, on September the 5th. Sinwar's Yahya Sinwar, of course, the newly elected leader of Hamas, secret plan to smuggle the Israeli hostages to Iran. So apparently Sinwar had a secret plan to take the hostages out of Gaza through the tunnels and take them to Iran. So let's have a look at, this is just one of the articles covering this, but this is probably one of the most in-depth from Israeli media, 972 magazine. Why did a British Jewish newspaper publish fake Israeli intelligence? So let's have a look at what they say about it in the article. I do recommend reading the whole article. There's a lot of detail in there that I can't cover today. The Jewish Chronicle's scoop quickly gained traction and was picked up and amplified by a plethora of right-wing Israeli media outlets and influencers, including Netanyahu's son, Yair. Even the Prime Minister's wife, Sarah, met with the parents of remaining hostages and reportedly told them there's no choice with the Philadelphia corridor, which is between Gaza and Egypt. There are reports that Hamas will flee to Iran with the hostages. There's only one problem. The story is totally made up. So let's see. 2 days later, Ynet journalist Ronan Bergman quoted 4 sources from Israel's intelligence community and the Israeli army's prisoners and missing persons division, who described the Jewish Chronicle's claims as wild fabrication and stated that no such document, which the article was based on, exists. Another described as 100% lies. IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari also officially dismissed the story as being baseless. Interesting that at the same time, Bild, one of the leading German propaganda outlets, also produced another story based on fake documents. But let's have a look at who is Elon Perry. This is where it actually becomes a complete Walter Mitty story. And again, I go to the actual article to read the full detail of his fabrication of his own CV. The story gets even stranger. The author of the Jewish Chronicle article is a man by the name of Elon Perry, who's published a series of scoops in the newspaper since the war began, so since October the 7th, including revealing new details about the Israeli army's recent assassinations of Hamas military commander Mohammed Deif, also proven false. Perry's bio on the Jewish Chronicle website states that he served as a commando soldier in Israel's Golani Brigade for 28 years, that he has 25 years of journalism experience, and that he lectures on the Middle East in both the US and the United Kingdom. He goes further, and all of that has effectively been debunked by the 972 magazine. So what happens? The proverbial rats, as I call them, have quit Jewish Chronicle, not out of principle, I would surmise, but because they don't want to be tarred with the same brush. So columnists Jonathan Friedland, Hardley Friedland, and David Ranovich have resigned from the Jewish Chronicle after it became embroiled in a scandal over a widely debunked story. And Elon Perry's work has been entirely scrubbed from the website. But who else has also jumped ship, so to speak? David Badiel, who we know very well at UK Column, has no plans to write for the Jewish Chronicle amid the fabrication row. So quite extraordinary, really.
Absolutely. It's very drop of the dead donkey. And well, we'll talk about more about that in extra as well. Now let's come back to the United States then, and the decision by the US Congress to pursue legislation to ban DJI drones in the United States. So this would not ban anybody that currently owns a drone manufactured by DJI, of course, the main manufacturer of drones in well, they're a Chinese company, but they sell mostly to all Western countries on this, and probably the most popular drone product that people have. But the US have decided that this is a major security risk. So they brought this piece of legislation through, HR 2864, Countering CCP Drones Act. Well, the question is why? So we have a little bit of video here from Representative Frank Pallone from a couple of months ago talking about this. Let's just have a listen to what he has to say.
In the last few months, we've seen reports that hacking groups linked to China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are gaining access to our communications networks to conduct surveillance, collect massive amounts of data, and manipulate our elections. And because of this, there's a real risk that the information that they collect could be used to launch cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure and undermine our democratic values of free speech.
Our democratic values of free speech. Well, I'm not quite clear how flying a drone around your back garden is going to do that, but okay, this is what they're claiming. And once again, they are attacking Chinese companies because this is how we build a narrative which is going to take us to war in the not too distant future. Anyway, let's come back to the UK, Charles, and land.
Land again, yes. I mean, something we talk about persistently for all sorts of reasons, but underpinned usually by the suggestion that we should not absolutely be growing food on it. We should be restoring nature and forgetting about the fact that the world's population is expanding. But in fact, before we come to the UK, we look at Brazil, where there's a tweet from DEFRA saying that Daniel Zeichner, the minister for DEFRA, has been at the G20 talking about sustainable agri-food systems. And of course, as with all these written documents, we see simply that food security is playing second fiddle to what's called nature recovery. This is the website itself about the G20 agriculture part of the Brazil meeting. Now, the reason this is pertinent, or because it coincides with the campaign for national parks, among others, effectively flagging how little of the national park infrastructure in the UK is owned by the state. And they are lamenting the fact because they say that their health check reports show that only 6% of national parks are currently effectively protected for nature. The next government needs to set out radical reforms to make these vital national assets wilder and accessible to all. The next Prime Minister must seize the opportunity to renew and revive national parks. Now, this goes back to the 1949 Act, which was supposed to grant the public access to areas, wilder areas, particularly in close proximity to large populations, concentrations of population. And the reason there's been sort of debate triggered now is not because it was in the Labour Party manifesto, but in effect they did make a sort of qualified pledge to be able to deal with this. And this has been highlighted now by a chap called Guy Shrubsole, who's recently written a book called The Lie of the Land, which has got a lot of traction in certain quarters. And he points out that just 10% of Britain's national parks are owned by the nation, 90% being privately owned, and he says that the park authorities are almost powerless to influence the private landowners. So the inference being that land in private hands is bad, land in state control is good. So he goes on to say the new Labour government needs to complete this unfinished business. Ministers must update the legal purposes of national park authorities so that restoring nature is their primary mission, and give them powers and resources to buy land for nature and for the nation. Now, it'd be very easy to look at a sort of simplified version of this without realising to what degree the baby would be thrown out with the bathwater, and to question whether or not government or state ownership and management of large tracts of land would really be any different. But nonetheless, they're pushing ahead with it. The national parks here in Northumberland and the Brecon Beacons, to give two examples, looking for project officers, but specifically relating to what's called natural capital, which I have spoken about quite a bit in the past. And just a reminder from March 2023, nature markets, which is really what natural capital is derived from, and it's described as a framework for scaling up private investment in nature recovery and sustainable farming. And the definition of a nature market would be a mechanism for private investment in nature through the sale of units of ecosystem services, which are delivered by nature restoration projects or improvement to land or coastal management. So the point that seems to be lost here is that in people's enthusiasms for schemes of nature recovery, first of all, they're forgetting the enormous amount of control the government does actually have over private landowners by all the various environmental schemes and subsidy with which they may exert a sort of carrot and stick influence, but also the erroneous suggestion, or at least one that lacks evidence, that the government would in fact manage the land any better. And in effect, this would be trading private ownership for corporate ownership via the financing of these natural capital schemes. So it's yet another theme in the idea that food security doesn't really matter. It's all about grabbing the land for nature recovery. We'll keep an eye on where this goes.
Okay, and we're going to finish today with Chris Underpants Bryant. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just type Chris Bryant and Underpants into any search engine and you'll find very quickly what I'm talking about. Well, he was speaking at the Connected Britain conference a couple of days ago, talking about the rollout of digital infrastructure and various fast internet connections and so on. Now let's have a quick look at what he was saying here. He ended off his speech. I'm not going to bore you with most of it, but he was talking about E.M. Forster's Only Connect. He wanted us, as Forster wanted us to connect the heart and the brain. I want us, as Bryant, I want us to connect our artistic and our technical abilities. He said, I want us to connect our finance, venture capitalist and tech industries. I want us to connect every part of the country, every community and every family. And above all, I want us as a government to be plugged into the solutions that connect us all. Does that make you feel comfortable and warm at heart there, that the government is connected into every aspect of our lives through this new digital infrastructure that they're rolling out?
It does not. I
No.
regret to say it really doesn't.
No, well, just keep in mind who it is that's pushing this, and perhaps we want to be starting to push back a little bit. We got to leave it there for today. I'm going to say thank you very much to Vanessa and Charles for joining me today, and for everybody that's watched. We'll be back in a few minutes. If you're a UK Column member, stay on the stream for UK Column News Extra. Otherwise, enjoy the interview at 1 p.m. tomorrow, and we'll see you on Friday. Bye-bye.